the smell of copper and wet asphalt, is something you never forget. It clings to the back of your throat, a grim reminder of life slipping through the cracks of the city. When 26-year-old nurse Kane Hayes knelt in that freezing Chicago alleyway, her hands pressing desperately against the torn throat of a dying elderly woman, she didn't see a headline. She didn't see power, and she certainly didn't see the matriarch of the most ruthless crime syndicate in the Midwest. All Kane saw was a fading heartbeat. She made a choice to save a stranger's life, unaware she had just signed a blood pact with the devil's own son. The neon sign of St. Thomas Memorial Hospital buzzed with a relentless, flickering hum, casting harsh blue shadows across the rain-slicked pavement. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Kane Hayes pushed through the heavy glass exit doors, the cold November wind instantly biting through her thin, faded scrub jacket. She was running on 3 hours of sleep, stale black coffee, and the terrifying knowledge that her rent was exactly 14 days past due. Kane was a registered nurse in the trauma ward, a place where the city's broken pieces washed up every night. She was good at her job. Too good, perhaps, because she felt every loss like a physical blow. But tonight had been relatively quiet until she began the 3-block trek to the dimly lit overflow parking lot where her rusted 2008 Honda Civic was parked. The rain was coming down in sheets, drowning out the ambient noise of the sirens in the distance. Kane hugged her bag to her chest, head down, walking past the narrow alleyway behind an abandoned textile factory. Then she heard it. It wasn't a scream. A scream would have been easier to ignore, easily written off as a drunken dispute. This was a wet, rattling gasp, the unmistakable sound of lungs struggling against fluid. Kane froze. Every survival instinct honed by years of living in the gritty South Side screamed at her to keep walking. But the nurse in her, the part of her that had watched her own mother die because an ambulance took 40 minutes to arrive, pivoted on her worn sneakers and stepped into the darkness. "Hello?" Kane called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" Near the rusted frame of a commercial dumpster, a shadow shifted. Kane pulled her phone from her pocket, activating the flashlight. The harsh white beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene that would forever brand itself into her memory. An elderly woman lay crumpled on the wet concrete, surrounded by a widening halo of dark, arterial blood. "Oh my God," Kane breathed, dropping to her knees, heedless of the freezing puddles soaking through her scrubs. The woman was perhaps in her late 70s. Despite the brutalization she had endured, there was an unmistakable elegance to her. Her silver hair was pinned up, though strands had come loose, matted with blood. She wore a tailored charcoal wool coat, the expensive fabric slashed open at the side. Kane's hands moved with practiced mechanical efficiency. She assessed the damage in seconds, a severe laceration to the right side of the neck, narrowly missing the jugular, and what looked like 2 deep puncture wounds in her lower abdomen. The woman had been stabbed, left to bleed out in the trash. "Stay with me," Kane commanded, her voice dropping into the authoritative register she used in the ER. She tore off her scrub jacket, ignoring the biting cold, and bundled it into a makeshift compress, pressing it hard against the woman's neck. "My name is Kane. I'm a nurse. You're going to be okay, but I need you to keep your eyes open. Do you understand?" The elderly woman's eyelids fluttered. Her skin was ashen, her lips tinged with the blue of hypoxia. She reached up with a trembling, blood-soaked hand, her manicured fingers gripping Kane's wrist with surprising, desperate strength. "Dom," the woman whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of her lips. "Tell Dom." Save your strength, Kane said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't apply pressure to the abdomen without letting go of the neck. She needed help. With her free hand, she fumbled for her phone, dialing 911. St. Thomas Memorial, South Alley, Kane barked to the dispatcher. Elderly female, multiple stab wounds, class 1 hemorrhage. I'm applying direct pressure, but she's going into hypovolemic shock. I need a bus now. For the next 6 minutes, Kane lived in a terrifying vacuum of time. The rain pounded against her back. The woman's grip on her wrist began to slacken. Kane talked to her non-stop, reciting the names of stars, the plot of movies, anything to keep the dying brain engaged. When the paramedics finally arrived, the alley erupted in blinding lights and shouting voices. Kane didn't step back. She climbed onto the gurney beside the woman, keeping her bloody hands locked on the wound, riding all the way to the trauma bay she had just clocked out from. Dr. Aaron Fisher, the attending on call, blinked in shock as Kane rolled in. "Hayes, I thought you went home." "Stab wounds to the neck and abdomen," Kane rattled off, stepping back only when the surgical team took over the airway. "Estimated blood loss is at least 2 liters. No wallet, no ID." As the nurses stripped the woman's ruined clothes to prep her for emergency surgery, something fell to the tiled floor with a heavy metallic clink. Kane bent down and picked it up. It was a solid gold rosary, but instead of a traditional cross, the centerpiece was a heavily embossed, intricate crest, a roaring lion holding a severed snake. Kane wiped a smear of blood off the gold. A cold shiver, entirely unrelated to her soaked scrubs, crawled down her spine. She slipped the rosary into her pocket for safekeeping, completely unaware that she was holding a beacon that would soon draw the most dangerous men in Chicago right to her doorstep. For 48 hours, the woman remained a Jane Doe in the intensive care unit. She had survived a grueling 6-hour surgery. Dr. Fisher had managed to repair the internal bleeding and stitch the neck wound, but her advanced age and the massive blood loss made her recovery precarious. Kane refused to go home. She slept in a vinyl chair in the break room, showering in the locker room, and checking in on the elderly stranger every hour. Her colleagues thought she was crazy. Nurse Brenda Walsh, a 20-year veteran with a sharp tongue, cornered Kane by the medication carts. "You're not Joan of Arc, Kane," Brenda scolded gently. "Social services will figure out who she is. You're off the clock. If a management catches you pulling unauthorized overtime just to sit with a Jane Doe, they'll write you up." "She was terrified, Brenda," Kane replied, staring at the floor. "And she was dressed in thousands of dollars worth of clothes, but nobody has called looking for her. It doesn't make sense. I want to be there when she wakes up." So she isn't alone. On the evening of the second day, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor shifted. Kane, who was sitting by the bedside reading a paperback novel, looked up. The woman's eyes were open. They were a piercing, lucid shade of hazel. Kane set her book down and approached slowly, offering a warm, exhausted smile. "Hi there. Welcome back." The woman blinked slowly, taking in the stark white walls, the IV lines snaking into her arms, and finally, the young woman with dark circles under her eyes. "You." The woman's voice was a dry, raspy croak. "The alley." "Yes." Kane poured a small cup of water and held a sponge swab to the woman's dry lips. "My name is Kane. You're at St. Thomas. You were hurt very badly, but you're safe now. Do you remember your name?" The woman's gaze hardened slightly, a flash of something steely and unyielding breaking through her frailty. "Carmela." "It's nice to meet you, Carmela," Kane said softly. "Do you have family we can call? A husband, children?" Carmela looked away, staring at the ceiling. "I have a son, He is difficult to reach. She turned back to Kane, her expression softening. You stayed. Why? You asked me to tell Dom something, Kane said, reaching into her pocket and placing the heavy gold rosary on the bedside table. I figured I should stick around in case you wanted to tell him yourself. Carmela stared at the crest on the rosary. A profound sadness crossed her face, followed by a terrifying realization. They took my phone. They left the crest. A message. She closed her eyes. Oh, my sweet girl. You should have walked away. What do you mean? Kane asked, confused. Before Carmela could answer, the atmosphere in the ICU shifted violently. It wasn't a sound, but an absence of it. The usual background noise of the hospital, the chatter of nurses, the squeak of rubber soles, the rattling of carts, was abruptly silenced. Kane frowned, stepping toward the glass door of the private room. She looked out into the hallway, and her breath hitched. The nurse's station was empty. Dr. Fisher was standing with his back against the wall, his face drained of all color. Lining the hallway were 6 men in impeccably tailored dark suits. They were built like linebackers, their faces stone cold, hands resting casually near the lapels of their jackets. The heavy double doors of the ICU swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A man walked in. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", with broad shoulders that seemed to command the physical space around him. He wore a midnight blue suit over a black shirt, no tie. His dark hair was sharply cut, and his jawline looked like it had been chiseled from granite. A faint, pale scar cut through his left eyebrow. But it was his eyes that made Kane take a step back. They were a violent, storm cloud grey, utterly devoid of warmth. He didn't look at the doctors. He didn't look at the armed men flanking the hallway. He walked straight toward Carmela's room. Kane, operating on pure, irrational protective instinct, stepped in front of the door, blocking his path. "Excuse me," Kane said, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to sound authoritative. "This is a restricted area. Only immediate family." The man stopped her. He looked down at her. The sheer force of his presence was suffocating. He didn't look angry. He looked predatory. He assessed her in a fraction of a second. Her faded scrubs, her exhausted posture, her defensive stance. "Move," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, quiet but carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. "I am her nurse," Kane said, lifting her chin, though her knees were trembling. "I need to see your ID, and I need you to step back." One of the suited men behind him moved forward, a hand reaching out to grab Kane, but the tall man raised a single finger. The suited man instantly retreated. The tall man leaned in close. Kane could smell expensive cologne, leather, and something metallic, like gunpowder. "My name is Keelan Rossi," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers. "That woman in there gave me life. If you do not step aside in the next 3 seconds, I will buy this hospital and have it bulldozed with you inside it." Kane's blood ran cold. Rossi, the Rossi family. Even in her exhausted state, she recognized the name. They didn't just run the organized crime in the city. They owned half the politicians and the police force. She was standing in the way of the devil himself. "Keelan." The weak, raspy voice came from inside the room. Keelan's terrifying facade cracked for a microscopic second. He bypassed Kane, pushing the glass door open, and approached the bed. The intimidating mob boss suddenly dropped to his knees beside the hospital bed, taking his mother's frail hand in his large, calloused ones. "Ma," he murmured, his voice cracking with an emotion Kane couldn't quite decipher. "I'm here, Dom," Carmela whispered, resting her hand on his dark hair. "I'm still here." Keelan turned his head slowly, looking back at Kane, who was hovering by the doorframe. His grey eyes were analytical, suspicious. The doctors said a civilian brought her in, found her bleeding out in an alley. Yes, Carmela said. This is Kane. She saved my life, Keelan. She stopped the bleeding with her bare hands. She has not left my side for 2 days. Keelan stood up slowly. He walked over to Kane, towering over her. The silence in the room was deafening. He reached out, and Kane flinched, bracing for violence. Instead, his large fingers gently grazed the dried, brown flakes of blood, still clinging to the cuff of her scrub pants. His mother's blood. You saved her, Keelan stated. It wasn't a question. It was a fact he was struggling to process. In his world, people caused the bleeding. They didn't stop it for strangers. I just did my job, Kane whispered, her throat dry. No, Keelan replied, his voice a low rumble. You did a miracle, and the Rossi family always pays its debts. The next 48 hours were a blur of surreal anxiety for Kane. Keelan Rossi had essentially commandeered the entire ICU wing. His men stood guard at the elevators, scrutinizing every doctor and nurse who approached. Despite the blatant violation of hospital policy, the hospital administrators remained entirely absent, clearly terrified into submission. Carmela was transferred to a private, luxury suite on the top floor, a floor that usually catered exclusively to wealthy donors. Kane, at Carmela's explicit request, was assigned as her sole, primary nurse. While Carmela was warm, maternal, and surprisingly funny, Keelan was a looming phantom. He rarely spoke to Kane, but she felt his eyes on her. He watched how she checked IV drips, how she gently turned his mother to prevent bed sores, and how she managed her pain medication. He was assessing her, searching for the angle, the hidden motive. Men like Keelan Rossi didn't believe in pure altruism. On Thursday morning, Kane finally clocked out, practically dead on her feet. Her shift had ended at 6 a.m. She drove back to her cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the south side. As she walked up the 3 flights of stairs, the familiar dread settled in her stomach. Today was the 15th. The eviction notice had been taped to her door 2 days ago. Her younger sister Sarah had passed away from leukemia a year ago, leaving Kane drowning in out-of-pocket medical bills and her own nursing school loans. She owed over $80,000 in total. She had $15 in her checking account. She turned the corner of her hallway and stopped. The bright pink eviction notice was gone. Frowning, Kane walked to her door. Taped to the wood where the notice had been was a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax bearing the Rossi lion crest. Kane's hands shook as she broke the seal. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock with a handwritten note in sharp, elegant cursive. The debt is settled. Be ready at 8 p.m. Dr. Behind the note were 3 documents. The first was a letter from her landlord, stamped paid in full for a 12-month lease extension. The second was a zero-balance statement from her student loan servicer. The third was a hospital billing statement for Sarah's care. Balance: $0. Kane stumbled backward, hitting the opposite wall of the hallway. She slid down to the floor, staring at the papers. Over $80,000, wiped out overnight. It wasn't a gift. It was an acquisition. Keelan Rossi hadn't just paid her debt. He had bought her. Panic clawed at her throat. She couldn't accept this. This was blood money. Extortion money. She grabbed her phone and tried to call the hospital, but she didn't even know how to reach him. For the rest of the day, Kane paced her tiny apartment. At 7:55 p.m., she heard the low, guttural purr of a heavy engine outside her window. She looked down. A massive, black Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows was idling by the curb. A man in a sharp grey suit stepped out. It was one of the men from the hospital. He looked up at her window and simply nodded. With a trembling breath, Kane put on her only decent coat, grabbed her purse, and went downstairs. "Miss Hayes," the man said. He looked to be in his late 40s with a broken nose and kind, crinkling eyes. "I'm Leo. The boss sent me." "I can't take this," Kane said immediately, shoving the envelope toward him. "I appreciate it, but I didn't save his mother for money. I can't be bought." Leo didn't take the envelope. He just smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Get in the car, Miss Hayes. Keelan Rossi doesn't take no for an answer. You'd better explain it to him yourself." The drive took 40 minutes, taking them far from the grit of the city into the sprawling, forested estates of Lake Forest. The Escalade pulled through massive wrought-iron gates, traveling down a winding driveway lined with towering oaks, until it stopped in front of a staggering, Gothic-style stone mansion. Leo led her inside, past armed guards and men speaking hushed Italian in the grand foyer. He guided her into a sprawling library that smelled of aged paper, leather, and cigar smoke. Keelan was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. He wasn't wearing a jacket, just a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and intricate, dark tattoos that snaked beneath his cuffs. He was nursing a glass of amber liquid, staring into the roaring fireplace. "Sit," he commanded softly, not turning around. Kane remained standing. "Mr. Rossi, I brought the papers back. I will contact the bank tomorrow and tell them there was an error. I cannot accept this." Keelan finally turned. The firelight cast harsh shadows across his scarred face. He stood, slowly walking around the desk until he was inches from her. Kane held her ground, forcing herself not to step back. "You think this is charity, Kane?" he asked, his voice a dangerous murmur. "You think I give a damn about your student loans?" "Then what is it?" she shot back. "It is a retainer," Keelan said smoothly. "My mother is being discharged tomorrow. She requires round-the-clock medical care, physical therapy and monitoring. She refuses to have strangers in the house. She wants you." "I have a job at the hospital." "You had a job at the hospital," Keelan corrected. "As of an hour ago, you resigned. You work for me now." Kane's jaw dropped. "You can't do that. You can't just dictate my life." Keelan reached out, his large hand gently wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was feather-light, but the implied threat was staggering. "My mother was attacked by the Mercer family. Silas Mercer ordered a hit on a 72-year-old woman to send me a message. They failed, and now they know you are the reason she survived." Kane's blood ran cold. The man in the alley, the missing phone. "You're not a hero anymore, Kane," Keelan said, leaning in so close she could feel the heat of his breath. His grey eyes were intense, burning with a violent possessiveness. "You're a target. If you walk out of those gates and go back to your little apartment, you will be dead in 48 hours. You belong to the Rossi family now. I bought your debts, and I bought your life. I expect you to move in tonight." Kane stared at the ruthless, beautiful man in front of her, realizing with absolute clarity that she hadn't just saved a life in that alley. She had lost her own. The sunlight filtering through the sheer silk curtains of the East Wing guest suite was a stark contrast to the cold, damp misery of Kane's old apartment. She woke up the next morning in a king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, feeling entirely like a hostage. True to his terrifying promise, Keelan Rossi had not allowed her to leave. Leo, the soft-spoken enforcer, had been sent to her apartment to pack her meager belongings. By midnight, Kane had been installed in a room adjacent to Carmela's newly outfitted medical suite on the estate's ground floor. The medical setup was staggering. Keelan hadn't just bought equipment, he had replicated a state-of-the-art ICU. There were cardiac monitors, a locked pharmacy cabinet, stocked with heavy-duty narcotics, and an oxygen filtration system. He had even flown in Dr. Harrison Sterling, a highly discreet trauma surgeon affiliated with Northwestern Memorial's private concierge wing, to oversee Carmela's initial discharge assessment. Kane spent the first 3 days operating in a state of high-functioning shock. She fell back on her training, throwing herself into Carmela's care to avoid confronting the reality of her captivity. She checked vitals, managed the intricate schedule of antibiotics and painkillers, and gently guided the elderly matriarch through painful physical therapy exercises. Carmela was an anomaly. In her silk pajamas, sipping chamomile tea and doing crossword puzzles, she looked like any beloved grandmother. But then Kane would overhear her speaking in rapid-fire Italian to Leo, casually authorizing the hostile takeover of a Southside shipping union or discussing the removal of a problematic alderman. The cognitive dissonance made Kane's head spin. And then there was Keelan. He was a constant, suffocating presence. He ran his criminal empire from the sprawling library down the hall, but his grey eyes always seemed to find Kane. He watched her measure out liquid morphine. He watched her change his mother's bandages. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was a low, commanding rumble that sent a shiver down Kane's spine. Late on her 4th night in the house, Kane found herself in the massive industrial-grade kitchen. She couldn't sleep. The quiet of the Lake Forest estate was unnerving compared to the constant sirens of her old neighborhood. She was stirring a mug of hot milk when the kitchen door swung open. Keelan walked in. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his tailored suit were gone, replaced by grey sweatpants and a tight black t-shirt that clung to his broad chest and the heavy musculature of his arms. The pale scar through his eyebrow looked more pronounced in the dim light of the refrigerator. He paused, clearly not expecting her to be awake. "Is my mother in pain?" he asked immediately, his posture going rigid. "No," Kane said, clutching her warm mug. "She's sleeping soundly. Her vitals are perfectly stable. I just couldn't sleep." Keelan grabbed a bottle of water, twisting the cap off with a sharp snap. He leaned against the marble island, watching her. "You're adjusting poorly to the quiet." "I am adjusting poorly to being kidnapped, Mr. Rossi." Kane shot back, the exhaustion finally eroding her filter. Keelan's jaw clenched. He took a step toward her, closing the distance until she had to tilt her head up to look at him. The smell of cedar, gun oil, and clean sweat washed over her. "I told you," he murmured, his voice dropping to that dangerous, intimate register. "If you had stayed in your apartment, Silas Mercer's men would have found you. They know my mother survived. They know a nurse from St. Thomas held her neck together. They are systematically bribing hospital staff to find your name. So I have to stay locked in this mansion for the rest of my life?" Kane demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'm a nurse, not a Mafia princess. I have a life." Keelan lifted a hand. For a terrifying second, Kane thought he was going to grab her throat. Instead, his knuckles gently brushed against her cheek, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was so tender, so entirely at odds with the violence he represented, that it made her breath catch. "Silas Mercer is a dead man walking," Keelan said softly, his grey eyes darkening with lethal intent. "It is only a matter of time before I find the rat in my organization who fed him my mother's location. Once Mercer is handled, the threat to you is neutralized." "And then I can go?" Kane whispered, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Keelan stared down at her lips, then back up to her eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and thick with unspoken tension. "Then," he finally said, his voice rough, "we will see if you still want to leave." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Kane trembling in the dark, entirely unsure if she was terrified of him or terrified of the sudden, treacherous flutter in her own stomach. By the end of the second week, Carmela's recovery hit a snag. A localized infection had flared up around the surgical site on her abdomen. While Dr. Sterling had prescribed heavy antibiotics, he insisted on a specialized CT scan to rule out an abscess, equipment that even Keelan couldn't easily smuggle into a residential estate. Arrangements were made in absolute secrecy. They would transport Carmela to a private diagnostic imaging center, located in a secure high-rise overlooking Lakeshore Drive. The facility was owned by a shell corporation tied to the Rossi family. Kane felt the tension radiating off the security detail that morning. Keelan was a coiled spring. He wore a Kevlar vest beneath his tailored black suit, and Kane saw the heavy, matte black grip of a Glock 19 holstered at his hip. "You stay in the center of the vehicle," Keelan ordered Kane as they loaded Carmela into the back of a heavily armored Mercedes Sprinter van. "Leo drives. I am in the passenger seat. 2 chase vehicles behind us, 1 in front." "It's just a scan, Dom," Carmela sighed, waving a dismissive diamond-ringed hand. "You're giving the poor girl a heart attack." "Silas Mercer has been too quiet," Keelan replied grimly, slamming the van doors shut. The convoy moved out, weaving through the morning Chicago traffic with militaristic precision. Kane sat in the back with Carmela, constantly checking the portable IV drip, pushing the antibiotics. They were 20 minutes into the drive, passing the sweeping views of the icy waters of Lake Michigan, when the world exploded. It started with a deafening screech of tires. A massive, reinforced garbage truck suddenly swerved across 3 lanes of traffic, T-boning the lead Rossi SUV. The impact was horrific, sending the SUV flipping through the air in a shower of shattered glass and screaming metal. "Ambush! Brace!" Leo roared from the driver's seat. Before Kane could even process the words, Keelan was out of his seat. He practically dove into the back compartment, his massive body pinning Kane and his mother to the floor of the van, just as the rear doors were peppered with high-caliber automatic gunfire. The armored plating held, but the sound was like being inside a ringing bell. "Keep your head down," Keelan barked at Kane, drawing his weapon. His eyes were wide, feral, and entirely focused. The van violently swerved as Leo tried to evade, but a black Lincoln Navigator slammed into their side, pinning them against the concrete median of Lakeshore Drive. "They've boxed us in, boss," Leo shouted over the sound of returning fire from the surviving chase vehicles. Bullets spider-webbed the bulletproof glass of the windshield. "Call the cleaners. Tell them we are compromised on the drive," Keelan ordered, kicking open the side door of the van. He looked back at Kane. "Do not move from this spot. Do you understand me? If a man comes through this door, and he is not me or Leo, you take this, and you pull the trigger." He unholstered a smaller, silver backup pistol from his ankle and shoved it into Kane's trembling hands. Before she could protest, Keelan was out the door. The sheer volume of gunfire outside was deafening. Kane huddled over Carmela, shielding the frail woman with her own body, tears streaming down her face. She was a nurse. She was trained to save lives, not take them. The cold metal of the gun in her hand felt like a live grenade. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Kane heard men shouting, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the asphalt, and the distinct, rhythmic crack-crack-crack of Keelan's pistol. Then, abruptly, the firing stopped. The sudden silence was punctuated only by the wail of approaching sirens in the distance. The side door was wrenched open. Kane screamed, raising the silver pistol, her finger shaking on the trigger. "Drop it, it's me!" Keelan yelled. He climbed into the van, breathing heavily. His immaculate suit was ruined, dusted with glass and concrete, but it was the dark, rapidly expanding stain on the left shoulder of his jacket that made Kane drop the gun. "You're shot!" Kane gasped, her medical training instantly overriding her panic. "It's a through and through. Leo is dead," Keelan said, his voice frighteningly hollow. He looked at the driver's seat. Kane caught a glimpse of Leo slumped over the steering wheel, blood pooling on the dashboard. Her stomach violently heaved. The kind man who had driven her to the estate was gone. "We have to move, now," Keelan commanded, grabbing a trauma kit from the wall of the van. He looked at Kane, his steely gaze locking onto her terrified eyes. "Can she walk?" Yes, with help," Kane stammered, scrambling to unhook Carmela's portable IV. "Good." Keelan grabbed Kane's arm, pulling her out of the van into the freezing Chicago's air. The highway was a war zone of burning vehicles and bodies. "We are walking away before the police arrive. You are going to patch this shoulder up in a safe house, and then I am going to find Silas Mercer, and I am going to burn his entire world to ash." The sirens on Lakeshore Drive faded into a chaotic, distant wail as Keelan dragged Kane and his mother through the labyrinthine alleys of the South Loop. They abandoned the flaming wreckage and hijacked a rusted 1998 Ford Taurus, idling outside a bodega. Keelan drove with one hand, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, the dark stain on his jacket spreading with agonizing speed. 20 minutes later, they pulled into a narrow, graffiti-lined alleyway in Pilsen. The safe house was hidden above an abandoned bakery, a dusty, windowless loft completely off the grid. It smelled of stale flour and old wood. Keelan locked the heavy steel door behind them, throwing 3 deadbolts before his knees finally buckled. He collapsed against the exposed brick wall, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Keelan!" Carmela cried out, clutching her abdomen as she hobbled toward him. "I'm fine, Ma," he gritted out, though his face was a terrifying shade of grey. He looked at Kane, his eyes burning with feverish intensity. "Bag. Table. Now." Kane didn't freeze. The panic that had paralyzed her in the van evaporated, replaced by the icy, clinical focus of a trauma nurse. She practically tore the trauma kit open, spreading gauze, iodine, hemostats, and a bottle of high-proof whiskey across the scarred wooden dining table. "Get his jacket off," Kane ordered Carmela, her voice completely steady. She cut away Keelan's blood-soaked shirt. It wasn't a clean through and through, as he had claimed in the adrenaline-fueled haze of the firefight. The bullet, likely a fragmented 9mm round, was lodged deep in the muscle of his deltoid, dangerously close to the brachial artery. "I have to take it out," Kane said, looking him dead in the eye. "If I don't, you'll go into septic shock by morning. But I don't have anesthesia. I only have lidocaine spray, and it won't be enough." Keelan grabbed the bottle of whiskey, took a long, punishing swallow, and slammed it back onto the table. "Do it!" For the next 45 minutes, the dusty loft became an impromptu operating room. Kane worked with brutal efficiency. Keelan didn't scream. He locked his jaw, the veins in his neck bulging, his right hand gripping the edge of the wooden table so hard, the timber audibly splintered. When Kane finally extracted the jagged piece of lead with a sickening clink into a metal bowl, she exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. She quickly flushed the wound with iodine and began to stitch the torn muscle and skin. As she tied off the final suture, her bloody hands finally began to tremble. She looked up and realized Keelan was watching her. Despite the agony, his grey eyes were entirely focused on her face, tracing the lines of her exhausted features. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Because I'm terrified," Kane admitted, her voice cracking. I just dug a bullet out of a Mafia boss on a kitchen table. My life is a nightmare." Keelan reached up with his good hand, his fingers gently wrapping around her wrist, smearing his blood against her skin. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met, Kane Hayes." The air between them thickened, heavy and charged, but the moment was shattered by Carmela, who was sitting on a cot in the corner, staring blankly at the wall. "It was sterling," Carmela whispered, her voice hollow. Keelan's head snapped toward his mother, his romantic vulnerability instantly evaporating, replaced by the cold, calculating aura of a predator. "What did you say?" "Dr. Sterling," Carmela repeated, looking at her son with tears in her eyes. "Before we left the house this morning, he asked me if we were taking the underground route or Lakeshore Drive. He said he needed to know for timing the MRI machine. I told him we were taking the drive. He was the only one outside the family who knew the route, Dom." The silence in the loft was deafening. Kane watched as the realization washed over Keelan. Dr. Harrison Sterling, the prestigious, untouchable concierge doctor, had sold them out to Silas Mercer. Keelan stood up. He didn't sway. The pain in his shoulder seemed completely eradicated by the sheer, unadulterated fury radiating from his pores. He walked over to a duffel bag hidden under the floorboards and pulled out a fresh, matte black assault rifle and 3 spare magazines. "Keelan, you just lost a pint of blood," Kane pleaded, stepping in front of him. "You can't go back out there." "Mercer thinks I'm dead, or at least dying," Keelan said, racking the slide of the rifle with a terrifying, mechanical finality. "He will be celebrating at his club in the Gold Coast. Sterling will be there to collect his 30 pieces of silver." He looked down at Kane, his expression softening just a fraction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy set of keys and a burner phone. "My men will be here in 10 minutes to guard you and my mother. Lock the door. If I am not back by dawn, Leo's brother will take you both to a private airstrip. There is a jet waiting to take you to Sicily." "Keelan, please," Kane whispered, realizing with a sickening jolt that she didn't want him to leave. The monster had become her protector. He leaned down and pressed a hard, searing kiss to her forehead. "I told you, Kane, the Rossi family always pays its debts, and Silas Mercer owes me for my mother's blood, and for Leo's." The rain in Pilsen didn't stop. It battered the frosted, wire mesh windows of the abandoned bakery safe house like a barrage of tiny fists, a relentless drumbeat to the longest night of Kane Hayes' life. She paced the length of the dusty floorboards, the adrenaline that had fueled her makeshift surgery on Keelan now evaporating into a cold, hollow dread. Outside the heavy steel door, the Rossi enforcers stood in absolute, terrifying silence. Among them was Matteo, the younger brother of Leo, the man who had died driving their van. The grief in the air was palpable, heavy enough to choke on. In the corner of the dim room, Carmela sat perfectly still on a canvas cot. She was clutching the gold rosary Kane had returned to her weeks ago, her lips moving in a silent, continuous prayer. "How do you do it?" Kane whispered, her voice cracking as she stopped her pacing. She wrapped her arms around her own torso, shivering despite the heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. "How do you sit there knowing he's out there doing what he's doing?" Carmela opened her hazel eyes, the exhaustion etching deep canyons into her face. "You think I am at peace, Kane? I am a mother. Every time my son walks out the door, a piece of my soul fractures." She patted the empty space on the cot beside her. "Sit with me." Reluctantly, Kane crossed the room and sank onto the stiff canvas. "Keelan was not born for this life," Carmela said softly, staring at the flickering shadows cast by a single, bare bulb overhead. "He was going to be an architect. He studied at Cornell. He loved the clean lines of things, the mathematics of buildings. But when he was 22, his father, Giovanni, was gunned down outside a steakhouse on Rush Street. It was a power grab by the Irish syndicates. They thought without Giovanni, the Rossi family would crumble. Carmela turned her head, fixing Kane with a look of profound, tragic gravity. They didn't realize what they had woken up. Keelan came home for the funeral, put away his blueprints, and went to war. He became the monster they forced him to be, so that the rest of our family could survive. He absorbs the sins of this world so we don't have to. Tonight, he's out there absorbing Silas Mercer's sins. For me, and for you. Kane squeezed her eyes shut, a tear slipping free to cut a hot track down her cheek. The image of the brutal, terrifying Mafia boss studying architecture, dreaming of building things rather than destroying them, broke her heart in a way she wasn't prepared for. At exactly 5:14 a.m., the heavy deadbolts retracted with a metallic clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Kane shot up from the cot, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Keelan walked in. He looked like a man who had crawled his way back from hell itself. His clothes were soaked through, plastered to his large frame by the freezing Chicago rain, and a copious, horrifying amount of blood that was distinctly not his own. The left side of his face was deeply bruised, his split lip still bleeding sluggishly. He was limping heavily on his right leg, his chest heaving with exertion. But his eyes, those violent, storm cloud grey eyes, were terrifyingly calm and razor-sharp. He didn't say a word. He limped directly to the scarred wooden dining table where Kane had operated on him hours earlier. He reached into his ruined trousers and dropped a heavy gold signet ring onto the wood. It hit the table with a dull, final thud. It bore the crest of the Mercer family, a coiled serpent. Carmela slowly stood up, looking at the ring. She crossed herself, kissing her thumb, and let out a long, shaky breath. It was over. Silas Mercer was dead. The war that had started in a dark alley behind St. Thomas Memorial Hospital was finally won. Keelan swayed slightly, his hand gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. Instantly, the nurse in Kane overrode the terrified civilian. She grabbed a clean towel and a basin of warm water she had kept ready. She stepped right up to him, entirely ignoring the aura of fresh death that clung to him. She gently took his face in her hands, using the damp towel to wipe the blood and grime from his cheekbones and his split lip. Keelan's breath hitched. His massive hands hovered in the air for a second before he gripped her hips, grounding himself in her warmth. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. For a fleeting, microscopic second, the untouchable king of Chicago simply let himself be held by the woman who had saved his mother. The following 3 weeks were a masterclass in psychological torture for Kane. With Silas Mercer eliminated, the Rossi empire quietly and ruthlessly absorbed the remnants of the rival organization. The Chicago Tribune's front pages were dominated by headlines of unprecedented gangland restructuring and mysterious disappearances. The police, heavily influenced by Rossi payrolls, ruled the Lakeshore Drive shootout a tragic escalation between anonymous factions. Dr. Harrison Sterling was reported as a missing person. His luxury sedan was found abandoned, with the keys still in the ignition near the Navy Pier. Kane and Carmela were swiftly moved back to the sprawling Lake Forest estate. A new, intensely vetted medical team, led by a tight-lipped private physician named Dr. Arthur Pendleton, was brought in to oversee Carmela's final stages of recovery. As Carmela grew stronger, Keelan became a ghost. He entirely avoided Kane. He locked himself in his study for days, conducting relentless meetings with his capos. When they did cross paths in the grand hallways, he would offer a curt nod, his eyes flat and unreadable, before moving past her. The sudden, freezing distance stung worse than his initial hostility. Kane felt used, a temporary tool that had served its purpose, and was now being politely ignored until she could be discarded. On a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 month after she had knelt in that blood-soaked alleyway, the summons finally came. Matteo knocked softly on her bedroom door, his face solemn. "The boss wants to see you in the library, Miss Hayes." Kane changed out of her scrubs, a habit she had kept out of comfort, and put on a simple black dress. She walked down the long, carpeted corridor, her stomach twisting into painful knots. The heavy mahogany doors of the library were open. The room smelled of expensive scotch, aged paper, and cedarwood. Keelan was standing by the roaring fireplace. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that perfectly hid the bandages still wrapped around his healing shoulder. On his massive desk sat a thick manila folder, a leather passport holder, and a sleek, aluminum Halliburton briefcase. "Sit," Keelan said softly, not turning around. Kane walked to the heavy leather armchair opposite the desk and sat down, keeping her spine rigid. "Your mother's latest blood panels came back perfectly clear today. Dr. Pendleton says the infection is entirely gone." "I know." Keelan turned, his face an impassive mask. "Her recovery is a miracle entirely orchestrated by you, which brings us to our final piece of business." He stepped behind the desk and popped the latches on the aluminum briefcase. He spun it around so Kane could see inside. It was packed to the brim with neatly banded stacks of $100 bills. "There is $2 million in untraceable cash in this case," Keelan stated, his voice devoid of any inflection. He tapped the manila folder. "This contains the deed to a secluded, fully staffed villa in Tuscany. The property taxes are paid for the next 20 years. Finally, he picked up the leather passport holder and tossed it onto her lap. "The passport is a flawless federal forgery. It belongs to a woman named Claire Harper, a clean slate, a new life." Kane stared at the passport, then up at the briefcase, her mind reeling. "You're kicking me out." "I'm freeing you, Kane," Keelan corrected, his jaw tightening. He leaned his knuckles on the desk, leaning toward her. "The men who targeted you are dead, but the Rossi name is a lightning rod. If you stay in Chicago, if you stay connected to this family, you will always be a target. Your services as a nurse are no longer required here. It is time for you to disappear and live the life you deserve." "You don't get to decide what life I deserve," Kane shot back, her voice trembling with a sudden surging anger. She tossed the passport back onto the desk. "You think you can just buy me off? Pay your debt and wipe your hands clean?" "This isn't about a debt," Keelan roared, the sudden explosion of volume rattling the crystal glasses on his bar cart. He rounded the desk, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her chair. The cold mask had finally cracked, revealing the desperate, terrified man beneath. "You are a healer. You bring light into rooms just by breathing. I am a butcher, Kane. My hands are stained permanently red. If you stay anywhere near me, I will eventually drag you down into the dark. I cannot ruin you." Kane stood up, refusing to cower. She was inches from him, her chin tilted up to meet his stormy gaze. "I grew up on the South Side, Keelan. I've been drowning in debt, working 80-hour weeks, watching good people die because they couldn't afford medicine. I was already in the dark." She reached down, picked up the pristine, forged passport from the desk, and looked him dead in the eye. With a deliberate, slow, and agonizingly loud tearing sound, she ripped the booklet entirely in half, dropping the ruined pieces onto the $2 million in the briefcase. Keelan stared at the torn passport, his breath hitching. "What the hell are you doing? I don't want a villa in Tuscany," Kane said, her voice dropping to a fierce, unwavering whisper. She slammed the briefcase shut. "And I don't want to be Claire Harper." She stepped even closer, pressing her palms flat against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel the erratic, heavy thudding of his heart beneath the silk of his shirt. "You think you're nothing but a monster," Kane said, searching his eyes. "But I watched you drop to your knees in a hospital and cry for your mother. I watched you take a bullet for me. You protect the people you love with a ferocity that most people spend their entire lives searching for. I'm not afraid of you, Keelan. I'm afraid of leaving you." Keelan's hands came up, hovering over her shoulders, visibly shaking. The formidable, terrifying mob boss, completely shattered under the weight of her unconditional acceptance. "Kane, if you stay, there is no going back. This life, it is paranoia and blood and violence. It will change you." "Then let it change me," Kane challenged, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I saved your mother's life. I saved your life. You owe me a debt, Keelan Rossi, and I am collecting it now." A ragged, desperate breath escaped Keelan's lips. He finally gave in. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her flush against his body with a crushing, possessive strength. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her like a drowning man finding oxygen. "I am yours," Keelan swore fiercely against her skin, his voice thick with raw devotion and a dark, unbreakable vow. "Until the day I die, and whatever comes after, I am yours." Kane closed her eyes, wrapping her arms around his waist. She had knelt in a freezing, wet alleyway to save a dying stranger, completely unaware she was walking into a war zone. But standing there, anchored in the arms of the devil himself, she realized she hadn't lost her life at all. For the first time, she had finally found it. The story of Kane Hayes proves that destiny rarely announces itself with trumpets. It usually arrives in the dead of night, disguised as a desperate choice. A single act of profound empathy, kneeling in the freezing rain to compress the wounds of a dying stranger, ripped an ordinary nurse from her mundane struggles and thrust her into the epicenter of a violent, unforgiving empire. In saving Carmela Rossi, Kane didn't just alter the power dynamics of Chicago's underworld, she unlocked the humanity in a man who had long surrendered to the darkness. A poor nurse saved a dying elderly stranger, unaware she was a mafia boss's mother, is a testament to the chaotic, transformative power of mercy. It shows us that true strength isn't found in pulling a trigger, but in having the courage to heal the broken, even when they belong to the shadows.